The first thing you need to understand about that day is that nobody expected it to matter. That's always how it goes, isn't it? The moments that change everything, the ones that get written into the history books and argued about in universities and whispered about in spaceports across 17 star systems, they never announce themselves. They don't come with warning sirens or dramatic music. They come quietly, dressed up as ordinary afternoons, and by the time you realize what you're watching, it's already over and the world is already different. I was 31 years old when I saw Staff Sergeant Darius Cole take a pulse round to the chest for the sovereign queen of the Veth Dominion. I was standing maybe 40 feet away. I remember everything. Chapter 1, Kearl Station, Upper Ring, 2247. Let me paint you the picture first, because the context matters more than people give it credit for. Kearl Station was, and still is, though it's changed considerably since, the single most important diplomatic hub in what we called the Outer Arm. It hung in the gravitational sweet spot between 3 star systems, built over about 60 years by 7 different species, and by 2247 it had grown into something that defied easy description. It wasn't a city exactly. It wasn't a military installation. It wasn't a marketplace, though commerce happened everywhere you looked. It was all of those things simultaneously, layered on top of each other like geological strata, each layer following its own logic and its own rules and its own time zone. The upper ring was where the politics happened. If you've never been to a multi-species diplomatic zone, I'm not sure I can fully convey what it feels like to stand in one. The air itself is managed. Different atmospheric compositions pumped into different corridors depending on who needs to breathe what. The lighting shifts depending on which wing you're in. Some species see best in spectra that give humans headaches. Others need gravity adjustments. The engineering alone is staggering. But the strangest part isn't the infrastructure, it's the noise. Languages, dozens of them, layering over each other in the main corridors. Translation modules humming at your ear, doing their best to catch up, always half a sentence behind. The clicks and resonances of Veth speech, which sounds to human ears like someone playing a cello in a cave. The high-frequency whistles of drawn communication. The deep, almost subsonic pulse language of the Gorathi, which you don't hear so much as feel in your sternum. And underneath all of it, the constant mechanical breath of the station itself. Ventilation systems, pressure equalizers, the distant vibration of ion thrusters keeping the whole structure in position. I was there as a journalist, have been for most of my adult life, stationed out of the Terran Diplomatic Press Corps, embedded with the Earth Expeditionary Representation for what was supposed to be a fairly routine summit. Trade routes, border agreements, the usual grinding work of interstellar diplomacy that nobody covers, because it doesn't make good headlines. I had no idea I was about to witness the most important 40 seconds in human-alien relations since first contact. Chapter 2, The Human Guard Corps. You need to understand what the Human Guard Corps was, and more importantly, what it wasn't. In 2247, humanity was still, if we're being completely honest, on probationary status in the galactic community. We'd been spacefaring for just under 100 years at that point. We'd made contact with 7 species. We'd fought one small, ugly war with the Gorathi that ended in a draw nobody was proud of, signed treaties with the Dran Collective, and had been circling cautiously around formal relations with the Veth Dominion for the better part of 2 decades. The Veth were the big one, that's just the truth of it. They were one of the oldest spacefaring species in the Outer Arm, with a civilization dating back roughly 12,000 years. Their technology was ahead of ours in ways that were genuinely humbling. Their dominion covered 43 star systems. Their military, the Veth Armada, was the most formidable fighting force anyone in our corner of the galaxy had ever encountered, and they knew it. And most of them weren't shy about the fact that they knew it. For them to be at Kearl Station, sitting across a table from human representatives, was already something. For their sovereign queen, Tessaveth IV, hereditary ruler of the entire dominion, to be physically present was nearly unprecedented. She'd made 3 off-world diplomatic visits in her entire reign. This was the third. The Human Guard Corps was a relatively new initiative. The idea was straightforward. Human soldiers, selected for their records and their temperament, assigned as ceremonial and security attachés to multi-species diplomatic events. It was partly practical. Having human security personnel at a human-attended summit made sense. But it was also symbolic. It was humanity saying, quietly and without making a big deal of it, "We can do this. We can stand in rooms with beings from a dozen different worlds and maintain composure and professionalism, and be trusted with serious responsibility." The selection process was brutal. Not physically brutal, though the physical requirements were significant. Psychologically brutal. They were looking for a specific kind of person. Someone who could stand still for 8 hours without fidgeting. Someone who could maintain eye contact protocols with species that had entirely different social rules around gaze. Someone who wouldn't freeze and wouldn't overreact, and could read a room full of beings they'd never encountered before, and make the right call in under a second. Darius Cole had been in the Corps for 3 years when I met him. Chapter 3: The Man Himself. I met Darius 2 days before it happened. I was doing background research, talking to anyone who'd give me a few minutes, trying to get a feel for the human presence at the summit. I'd interviewed 3 diplomats, 2 aides, and a logistics coordinator, and I was starting to feel like I was drowning in institutional language. Everything was carefully phrased. Everything was calibrated. Nobody said anything that wasn't already in the press kit. Then I found Darius on a break in one of the smaller side corridors, a maintenance access hallway that a few of the guards used as an informal break spot, because it was quiet and the atmospheric mix was reliably comfortable for humans. He was sitting on an equipment crate, eating what appeared to be a protein bar that had seen better days, reading something on a battered personal device. He looked up when I came in, clocked my press credentials, and went back to his reading. "You mind if I ask you a few questions?" I said. "I mind a little," he said, which I appreciated more than if he'd said no. "But you're going to anyway, so go ahead." That was Darius. He was 34 years old, originally from a small town in the American Southeast, a place called Dalton, Georgia, which he mentioned exactly once and without any particular sentimentality. He joined the military at 18, served 2 tours in the outer system defense installations, then been recruited for the Guard Corps based on, in his words, "test scores I'm still suspicious of." He had the kind of face that didn't give much away, dark brown eyes, patient, watchful, medium build, though the build was misleading because the Corps trained you in ways that didn't necessarily show on the surface. There was a stillness to him that I noticed immediately, and that I've thought about many times since. He wasn't unfriendly, he just didn't perform friendliness. There's a difference. I asked him what the job was actually like, day to day. He thought about it for a moment. Honest thought, not the performative pause people use to seem thoughtful. "Mostly standing," he said. "Lot of standing. A lot of being very aware of where you are in relation to everyone else in the room. A lot of learning the protocols for 17 different species, so you don't accidentally insult someone by making eye contact at the wrong moment or standing in a position that reads as aggressive in a culture where that matters. Does it feel strange, being the human in the room, sometimes the only human?" He looked at me like he was deciding whether the question was worth a real answer. "It feels like a responsibility," he said finally. "That's the cleanest way I can put it. Everything we do, every interaction, we're not individuals in those rooms. We're humans. What I do reflects on 7 billion people. That either weighs you down or it sharpens you. You pick one. Which did you pick?" He smiled, small and genuine. "I picked the one that kept me employed." He went back to his protein bar. I sat with him for another 20 minutes and we talked about other things, the station's atmospheric management systems, which he found genuinely fascinating, the particular challenge of maintaining the required stillness in a Veth ceremonial context, where any movement during certain protocols was considered a form of speech. He'd studied extensively. He knew things about Veth culture that I, a journalist who'd been covering alien affairs for 9 years, didn't know. I liked him. I wrote that in my notes that night. Liked him immediately, which doesn't happen often. 2 days later, I watched him take a pulse round to the chest, and I understood that the man I'd sat with for 20 minutes in that hallway had already made his choice long before the moment arrived. Chapter 4. The Summit, Day 3. The morning of the third day started the way the previous two had, with the kind of quiet, controlled efficiency that multi-species diplomatic events require. The upper ring's main ceremonial corridor had been configured for a formal procession. This was Veth protocol, specifically, the formal greeting ceremony that preceded the signing of any major agreement, a tradition dating back several thousand years in their culture. The sovereign queen would walk the ceremonial corridor, attended by her court and her personal guard, and the representatives of each allied or treaty partner species would be positioned along the route in a specific order that itself communicated their status in Veth diplomatic hierarchy. Humans were 7th, out of 11, which, for a species that had been in formal contact with the Veth for less than 20 years, was actually considered a meaningful acknowledgement. I had a press position, third-tier observation gallery, which gave me a clear line of sight to the middle section of the corridor. I had my recording equipment calibrated for the lighting, which was Veth preference amber gold, slightly warm for human eyes but manageable. Around me, about 15 other journalists, a handful of aides, and 2 other Guard Corps members who weren't on floor duty. The procession began on time, which, in multi-species diplomacy, is itself a small miracle. The sovereign queen Tessaveth IV was, and I've struggled to describe this to people who weren't there, simply unlike anyone I'd ever been in the same room with. Not physically, though the Veth were physically striking. Tall, bilaterally symmetrical in a way that was familiar enough to not be jarring, with skin that shifted tone in response to emotional state, bioluminescent patterns along the jaw and collarbone that in Veth culture functioned as a form of auxiliary expression. She moved with a deliberateness that wasn't slowness. It was something else, something more like the movement of something that has never once considered the possibility of being hurried. She was accompanied by 6 members of the Veth Royal Guard, the Teshari, her personal protection detail. They were armored in the ceremonial black and silver of the Dominion, carrying the long-form ceremonial weapons that served a dual purpose as both symbol and function. They were positioned around her in a formation that I recognized from my research as the Veth inner-ring protective configuration, 2 forward, 2 flanking, 2 rear. Darius Cole was positioned at the 7th marker, the human delegation's position, standing with 3 other Guard Corps members in the formal address stance that Veth protocol required. Back straight, hands behind the back, eyes at middle distance, no direct gaze toward the Queen herself unless she addressed you. He was about 40 feet from where I was watching. I remember noticing how still he was. Even in a corridor full of beings doing their best to maintain formal posture, Darius was noticeably, almost uncannily still. The kind of stillness you earn. Chapter 5. The Moment Before. Here's what happened in the 90 seconds before everything changed. There was a disruption at the far end of the corridor. I heard it before I saw it, a shift in the quality of the ambient noise, a ripple of something that my brain categorized as wrong before I had conscious language for it. The procession continued, because that's what you do in the early stage of an ambiguous disturbance. You continue until you have reason not to. Then I saw the figure moving through the crowd. Later investigation would identify him as a member of the Gorathi separatist faction, a splinter group that had been operating in the outer arm for about 18 months, opposed to the growing diplomatic alignment between the Veth Dominion and the Terran Confederation for reasons that were complex, and in the end, almost beside the point in that corridor. What matters for the story is what he was doing and what he was carrying. He was moving with purpose through the rear section of the observer gallery, not my gallery, the lower one, ground level, and he had a weapon. A compressed pulse emitter, the kind that was nominally illegal in Curl Station's weapons accords but small enough to have gotten through the security sweep in whatever modification had been made to its signature. He was moving toward a clear angle on the Sovereign Queen. The Teshari saw him at almost the same moment several of the other guards did. Security protocols activated, which meant the guard formation was supposed to tighten around the Queen and move her toward the sealed emergency alcoves in the north wall of the corridor. This is where things happened faster than I can fully reconstruct even now, even with the footage I've reviewed probably 100 times. The Teshari moved. They were fast, genuinely fast, faster than any human reflex I've ever seen, and I've spent years around soldiers. They began the protective formation shift. But the geometry was wrong. The angle the Gorathi separatist had found, whether by accident or by careful advance planning, which was later debated extensively, put him in a position where the Queen's movement toward the north alcove actually increased her exposure for approximately 3 seconds. The alcove direction required her to cross an open sightline. The Teshari's natural protective configuration tightened around her existing position, but hadn't fully accounted for the movement vector. 3 seconds of open window. A pulse round fired at that moment would hit her. The Teshari were correcting. They would have corrected, probably. In those 3 seconds the probabilities were not good, but they were working toward better. Darius Cole covered 40 feet, in what the later reconstruction estimated as approximately 1.8 seconds. Chapter 6, 40 feet. I want to try to describe this accurately, because I've read other accounts that make it sound like a movie moment, slow motion, dramatic, self-conscious. It wasn't any of those things. It was exactly the opposite. It was so fast and so immediate that the emotion of it didn't hit me until it was over, because my brain simply couldn't process in real time what my eyes were seeing. He moved. That's the simplest way to put it. He moved in the way that very few people move, without hesitation, without the fractional pause that most humans experience between decision and action. No gap. He was standing at the 7th marker, and then he was moving, and there was no moment between those two things where he was deciding. The decision was already made. Whether it was made in that instant or whether it had been made years ago in some formative layer of who he was, I genuinely couldn't tell you. He crossed 40 feet. The Gorathi separatist fired. The pulse round, a compressed electromagnetic burst wrapped in a kinetic core, designed primarily for penetrating personal shielding, struck Darius Cole in the upper left chest at a range of approximately 22 feet. He went down. He didn't fly backward the way things do in stories. He went down the way real things go down, folded forward first, then knees, then the rest of him, the momentum of his own forward movement carrying him another few feet even as his body was failing. He ended up approximately 8 feet from where Queen Tessaveth IV was standing. The Teshari closed the formation. The Queen was secure. Security teams converged on the separatist. Other Guard Corps members were moving toward Darius with medical equipment. And the Queen, who should have been moving toward the secured alcove, who was surrounded by 6 armed guards physically steering her in that direction, stopped. She stopped walking. She turned around. She looked at Darius Cole on the floor. And that was when everything changed. Chapter 7, What She Did. In 22 years of journalism, I have stood in rooms where history was made. I have been present for treaty signings and first contacts and moments of genuine turning point significance. I know what it feels like to be in a room where something is shifting, where you can feel the weight of the moment even before you have words for it. What happened next was the most significant thing I have ever personally witnessed. The Teshari, her personal guard, the beings whose entire function is her physical safety, physically attempted to move her. Gently, respectfully, but physically. Two of them took positions at her flanking and applied the standard emergency escort pressure, the formal guidance that says, without words, "Sovereign, we must move." She stood her ground. In Veth culture, and I want to be very precise here because this is important, a sovereign resisting the emergency escort of the Teshari is not simply an unusual act. It is, technically, a violation of the Dominion's own safety codes, codes that the sovereign herself had the authority to write, but also was supposed to be subject to. In the entire recorded history of the Teshari Corps, stretching back roughly 400 years, no sovereign had ever refused the emergency escort once it was formally initiated. She refused it. She turned toward Darius Cole, who was on the floor with two Guard Corps medics working on him, and she walked toward him. Through the Teshari formation, which parted because what else could they do, and toward the space where a human soldier was lying with a pulse round in his chest, still conscious, which later everyone agreed was remarkable given the force of the impact. She knelt beside him. Now, if you don't understand Veth culture, you cannot fully appreciate what kneeling means. The Veth have a very specific symbolic vocabulary around physical position. It's tied to their deepest social and spiritual frameworks. A Veth bowing is a significant gesture. A Veth kneeling is. The closest human equivalent I've been able to find is somewhere between a genuflection and an oath-taking. It's not something they do casually. It's not something they do often. And a sovereign who by Veth law and tradition exists in a state of being that places her physically and spiritually above all other living beings in the Dominion, kneeling in a public space, before witnesses from 11 different species, on the floor of a diplomatic corridor. There's no precedent. I looked. The historians looked. There is no precedent in 4,000 years of Veth recorded history. She knelt beside him on the floor. Her bioluminescent markings, which had been a controlled deep blue throughout the formal proceedings, the color of Veth authority and composure, shifted. In Veth chromatic language, what her markings shifted to is typically translated as either profound grief mixed with honor, or, in some interpretive traditions, recognition of the sacred in the unexpected. The translation debate became famous later. For our purposes, what matters is that she was not performing it. The chromatic shift in Veth physiology is involuntary. It is the body expressing what the mind is processing. There is no way to fake it. She was genuinely, viscerally moved. She placed her hand on his chest, careful of the wound, her long fingers finding a position that didn't add pressure, and she spoke to him in Veth. The translation came through the corridor systems a moment later. Some translations are precise, and some are approximate, and some are simply the best available version of something that doesn't quite exist in the target language. This is what the system gave us. You are seen. What you have given is not a debt. It is a covenant. Your people have shown something today that my people have not encountered in many generations of star walking. I will carry this. Darius Cole, lying on the floor of the ceremonial corridor of Curl Station with a compressed pulse round in his chest, looked at the sovereign queen of the Veth Dominion kneeling beside him, and said, in the way that people say things when they're in shock and the filters are down, and only the true things are coming out. I wasn't going to let that happen, ma'am. His voice was clear, slightly strained from the wound, but clear. The silence in that corridor lasted about 4 seconds. Then it was broken by something none of the human observers had ever heard before from a Veth delegation. Sound. Vocal, untranslated, raw sound from the Veth court members present. A tone in the lower registers of Veth vocalization that the translation systems flagged as communal expression of profound witness. They were moved. 40-some members of the Veth Court, trained from birth in the protocols of public emotional restraint, broke protocol together because what they had just seen broke something open in them that protocol couldn't contain. I was standing in the observation gallery with my recording equipment still running, and my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the unit. Chapter 8: The Hours After. The Gorathi separatist was taken into custody by station security within 90 seconds of the shot. That process was efficient and unremarkable, and ultimately led to a very significant political situation for the Gorathi government, which we'll get to, but in the immediate aftermath, nobody in the corridor was thinking about that. They were thinking about the Queen on the floor and the soldier she was kneeling beside, and what it meant. Darius was transported to the station's medical bay within about 4 minutes. The pulse round had hit him high and to the left, which was both lucky and unlucky in specific ways. It had missed his heart by what the medical staff later described as a margin that I would call fortunate in any species. The electromagnetic component had caused significant tissue disruption in the surrounding area. The kinetic core had fractured 2 ribs and bruised a third. He was going to need surgery and several weeks of recovery. He was alive. The Queen did not go to the secured alcove. She accompanied the medical team to the bay, over the continued and increasingly desperate objections of the Teshari, who were by this point having what appeared to be the worst professional day in the history of their institution. She stood in the corridor outside the medical bay while surgery was performed, not waiting in the diplomatic suite, not receiving briefings. Standing in the corridor, with 2 of her guard at her side, while human medical staff worked on a human soldier. News of what had happened spread through Curl Station in the way that significant things spread through enclosed spaces, where everyone is already watching each other closely, instantly, and with enormous amplification. Within an hour, every news service covering the summit had at least a partial account. Within 3 hours, we had footage mine, among others, and the footage was already traveling across the communication networks toward Earth, and toward the 43 systems of the Veth Dominion, and toward every other inhabited system that had a relay station in range. I filed my first report from a corner of the press bay, talking faster than I normally talk, trying to find language for something I was still processing emotionally, even as I was professionally obligated to describe it. I remember the editor at the Terran Dispatch asking me, over the comm, whether I could characterize what exactly the Queen's gesture signified in terms of diplomatic implications. I told her I couldn't characterize it. Not yet. Not because I didn't have an opinion, but because the moment was still happening, and I didn't want to reduce it to diplomatic shorthand before I fully understood what I'd seen. She said, "Best guess." I said, "Everything just changed." She said, "That's a headline." Chapter 9. That night. The summit was suspended for 24 hours, standard protocol following a security incident. The delegations retreated to their respective quarters. Station security conducted a full sweep and review. The Gorathi delegation, which had nothing to do with the separatist faction and was horrified by what had happened, immediately requested an emergency meeting with station authorities to formally distance themselves from the attack. I spent most of that night reviewing footage, talking to sources, and trying to sleep, in that order and with decreasing success. What kept coming back to me wasn't the moment of the shot, or even the Queen kneeling. It was Darius in that maintenance corridor 2 days earlier, telling me that everything a guard does reflects on 7 billion people, that you pick whether it weighs you down or sharpens you. He'd picked sharpened, and in a single corridor, in under 2 seconds, he'd done more for human-alien relations than the previous 20 years of diplomatic summits combined. Not because it was calculated, precisely because it wasn't, because the most significant thing about what he did was that it was real, unplanned, unscripted, instinctive in the deepest sense of the word. The Queen had been in rooms full of humans before. She'd read the briefings and the diplomatic analyses and the cultural assessments. She knew, intellectually, what humans were. What she hadn't seen was what humans did when there was no time to think. And what we did, in the person of one soldier from Dalton, Georgia, was cover 40 feet in 1.8 seconds and put our body between her and a pulse round. That tells you something that no briefing can. Chapter 10, The Statement. The Queen's formal statement came the next morning. It was read by the first voice of the Veth Court, a ceremonial role roughly analogous to a combination of herald and interpreter, in the main assembly hall of the upper ring, with all delegations present and the full press corps in attendance. I was in the front row. I had my recorder running. My hands this time were steady. The statement was long by the standards of Veth formal communication. Veth political statements tend toward precision and brevity, which means what passed for long in their tradition was still shorter than most human diplomatic speeches. The translation came through clean. I'll tell you what it said, as accurately as I can without reproducing the full text. It opened by formally acknowledging the events of the previous day, the attack, the security response, and what the first voice described as an act of bodily sacrifice that the Veth Dominion will record in perpetuity. It then addressed the specific nature of Darius Cole's action, in terms that I don't think any human analyst had fully anticipated. The Veth do not, as it turns out, have a strong cultural tradition of the individual heroic act in the way that humans do. Their social and military structures are heavily collective. The idea of one being breaking formation to act unilaterally is, in many Veth contexts, considered a failure of discipline rather than an expression of it. But the Queen's statement said, and I'm paraphrasing the translation, that she had come to understand this human act as something different, that the human soldier had not broken formation out of individual impulse or disregard for collective order. He had, in the most immediate possible way, extended the definition of his formation to include her, without being asked, without being ordered, without calculation. He had simply, in the moment of crisis, treated her life as something he was responsible for. And in Veth culture, where the question of who you are responsible for is one of the deepest and most sacred questions of moral life, that was not a small thing. The statement then said something that caused every diplomat in the room to immediately begin composing urgent messages to their home governments. The Veth Dominion hereby recognizes the Terran Confederation as a people of covenant. This recognition carries formal status under Dominion law and diplomatic tradition. It is extended not in response to the agreements discussed at this summit, which continue on their separate course, but in recognition of a truth demonstrated by direct action, that humans extend their circle of responsibility beyond their own kind. This is the quality the Dominion most respects. We have found it in the Terran people. A people of covenant. I had to look it up that night to fully understand what it meant in Veth legal and cultural tradition. It's a status that, in the entirety of Veth diplomatic history, had been extended to two other species. Both of them were considered among the Dominion's closest and most trusted long-term allies. The implications took years to fully play out. They're still playing out in some respects. But in that moment, in that room, what I watched was every human diplomat going very still in the way that humans go still when they are trying to process something enormous without visibly falling apart. Then I watched the head of the Terran delegation, Ambassador Chen Lihua, 26 years in diplomatic service, not a person given to emotional display, press her hand over her mouth. Her eyes were wet. She composed herself in about 10 seconds and went back to her professional face. But I saw it. End of Part 1. Part 2. Chapter 11. Room 7, Medical Bay, Curl Station. He didn't know what had happened. That's the part that gets me every time I think about it. By the time Darius came out of surgery and was conscious enough to have a conversation, the galaxy had already begun to change in response to what he'd done, and he was lying in a medical bay with 2 fractured ribs and a tube in his arm that was delivering a pain management cocktail the station's physician admitted wasn't optimally calibrated for human physiology. The Guard Corps commander, Colonel Aisha Nkemdiram, who I'd interviewed briefly on day 1 of the summit, was there when I arrived. She'd cleared press access to a brief post-surgery conversation, which told me she understood the significance of what was happening and wanted it documented correctly. Darius was awake. He looked pale, which on his complexion meant something. The wound area was bandaged under a thermal management wrap. He was propped slightly upright, which seemed to be a compromise between what the medics wanted and what he was willing to accept. He looked at me when I came in and said, "You're the journalist." "I am," I said. "From the hallway 2 days ago." "Yes." He thought about this for a moment. "How bad is it?" he said, meaning the coverage, meaning the story, meaning I understood what the world was saying about him. "It's significant," I said. "It's going to be significant for a long time." He made a sound that wasn't quite a sigh and wasn't quite a laugh. "Great." I asked him if he remembered what happened. He said he remembered most of it. I asked him what it had been like, the actual moment of moving. He was quiet for long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. "You know how sometimes you don't remember making a decision," he said finally. "You just remember having made it. Like you come back into awareness and the decision is already behind you somewhere." "Yes," I said. "Like that." He looked at the ceiling. I saw the angle, I understood what the angle meant, and then I was moving. There wasn't a middle part. There wasn't a moment where I thought about it and decided yes. I just moved. "Were you afraid?" Long pause. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I know I was afraid after, when I was on the floor. That was yes, I was very afraid." He said it matter-of-factly, which somehow made it more meaningful than if he'd said it dramatically. I remember thinking, well, this is bad, with that kind of clarity you get when the situation is very clear. He almost smiled. "And then she was there," he said. "And that was, I don't have words for it, that was something else entirely." I asked him what it had felt like, to have the Queen kneel beside him. He was quiet again, for a different kind of long time. "Like being seen," he said at last. "Not in a, I don't mean it in an arrogant way. I mean something in the act of her doing that, it felt like being truly, completely seen. Like she looked at what I'd done and she understood it, not the politics of it, not the diplomatic implications of it. She understood the thing itself. The specific human thing I'd done." He paused. "I don't know if I'm making sense." "You're making sense," I said. "I grew up in a small town," he said, which seemed like a non sequitur until it wasn't. "Not a lot of belief in those parts that we mattered much, you know. That people like us, regular people, not famous people, not special people, that we figured into anything important. You carry that with you, that sense of scale, that you're small." He looked at the ceiling again. "But when she looked at me, I didn't feel small. I felt like I had done something that had weight. That mattered in the actual weight-measuring universe, not just in a good job, son way." He stopped himself. I think he thought he'd said too much. I'm glad he didn't stop sooner. Chapter 12, The Galaxy's Response. You want to talk about what happened next, you have to talk about scale. Within 48 hours of the footage going public, it had been viewed, reliably estimated, given the multi-system relay networks, by somewhere in the range of 4 billion humans. That number is hard to hold in your head even when you're trying to take it seriously. 4 billion people watching the same 30 seconds of corridor footage, watching a soldier from a small town in Georgia cover 40 feet and go down, and watching the most powerful being in the outer arm kneel on the floor beside him. The human response was not simple, because human responses are never simple, but it had a dominant thread running through it that you could follow if you were paying attention. It was pride. The specific kind of pride that people feel not for something they personally did, but for something that confirms what they secretly believed was true about themselves. Humans saw Darius Cole do what he did, and something in them said, "Yes, that is what we are. That is the thing we knew about ourselves that we hadn't been able to show." The Veth response was more complex and took longer to propagate through their networks, partly because of the relay distances, and partly because Veth public discourse moves more deliberately than human discourse, which tends to erupt. But when it propagated, it was significant. The dominant response in the Veth public sphere, and I'm drawing here on the analysis provided by the translation teams who spent several weeks reviewing Veth media from the period, was something like astonishment. Not astonishment at the act itself, which I'm told many Veth found comprehensible once explained. Astonishment at the nature of it. At the specificity of the decision, that a human had looked at the situation and chosen, without calculation, to include the Queen within the boundaries of his own protected sphere. There's a Veth philosophical concept. I'll avoid the original term because the transliteration is clumsy, that translates roughly as the expanding circle. It refers to the question of who you include within your moral consideration. Do you keep the circle small and defined, protecting only your own, or do you actively extend it outward toward others? In Veth moral philosophy, the expansion of the circle is considered one of the highest expressions of developed consciousness. Darius Cole had expanded his circle to include a being from another species entirely, a being he had no personal relationship with, a being whose culture and language and biology were radically different from his own. And he'd done it in under 2 seconds, which in Veth philosophical tradition suggested that the expansion wasn't a conscious decision, but a reflection of something fundamental about his character. And by extension, if you followed the argument about human character, this was not a small thing to be thought about you. The response from other species was varied and interesting in its variety. The Dran collective's official statement was warm but characteristically analytical. They were interested in the military protocol implications and whether the Guard Corps would update their procedures to account for this kind of individual action. The Gorathi government, as mentioned, was in a state of diplomatic crisis over the separatist connection, and their public communications were mostly occupied with distancing themselves from the attack and condemning it as emphatically as possible. The smaller species with representation at Kurl Station had responses ranging from admiring to frankly confused. The concept of individual sacrifice for a non-kin being was genuinely alien to some of them in ways that required extended cultural explanation. But none of those responses changed the fundamental shape of what had happened. The Veth had spoken, and the Veth had a specific kind of weight in the outer arm that made their speaking matter. Chapter 13, The Political Earthquake. I want to be honest about this part, because it would be easy to tell this story only as an emotional narrative and leave out the hard-edged political reality that ran alongside it. They happened simultaneously. You can't understand the full significance without both. The Covenant Declaration changed the terms of the summit completely. What had been, before the incident, a relatively standard trade and border agreement negotiation suddenly had a foundation of something that was not standard at all. The Veth, in Dominion law, treat Covenant-recognized species differently at the table, not just symbolically, practically. There are categories of information sharing, of technology transfer, of mutual defense consideration that become available to Covenant-recognized species that are not available to others. The Terran diplomatic team, once they'd absorbed the shock, spent about 18 hours in intense internal consultation with Earth governments before returning to the table. I'm told, from sources inside the delegation, that the consultation included voices who were cautious about the implications, who worried about the responsibilities that came with the recognition, who wondered whether humanity was ready for what covenant meant in practical terms, and voices who said, "We don't get to choose whether we're ready, we were already recognized. The question is what we do with it." The summit ultimately produced a treaty that went significantly further than any human-Veth agreement in previous history. Not in every dimension. Some things still needed years more negotiation. But the foundation of trust that the Queen's statement had formally established changed what was possible at the table. 3 major technology-sharing agreements, which had been stalled for years over Veth hesitation about Terran reliability as a partner, were suddenly moving. A mutual defense consultation framework, not a full alliance, but the beginning of one, was proposed by the Veth side for the first time ever. A formal exchange program for military personnel and diplomatic corps members from both species was established, which Darius Cole himself would eventually participate in once he'd recovered, spending 6 months as the first human military attaché formally embedded with a Veth Armada unit. But all of that is the institutional story. The more interesting story, to me, is what happened to the individual human soldier from Dalton, Georgia, and what happened between him and the Queen in the weeks that followed, and what that told us about the specific human quality that had made everything else possible. Chapter 14, The Second Meeting. 3 weeks after the incident, Darius Cole was ambulatory, healing well, and technically still assigned to the Guard Corps unit at Curl Station, while his medical clearance for full return to duty was processed. The Queen had remained at Curl Station through the extended summit proceedings rather than returning to the Dominion as originally planned. This was itself not a small thing. Sovereigns don't change their travel itineraries casually. The court managed it as a reflection of the Queen's commitment to seeing the treaty process through to completion, which was technically accurate but not the complete picture. The second meeting between Darius and the Queen was arranged through the Veth Court's protocol office and coordinated with the Guard Corps. It was described, officially, as a formal recognition audience, a Veth tradition in which the sovereign formally acknowledges the actions of someone who has served the Dominion in a significant way. I was not in the room for this one. Only 4 humans were: Darius, Colonel Nkemdiram, Ambassador Chen, and a protocol officer from the Terran delegation. The meeting was not recorded, which was a specific mutual decision by both sides, and I respect that even though the journalist in me still feels the sting of it. What I know comes from 3 sources: Darius himself, who talked to me afterward, Colonel Nkemdiram, who gave a brief and carefully worded account, and the Veth Court's official summary, which was released in formal Veth diplomatic language and required significant translation work. The meeting lasted approximately 40 minutes. Darius went in not knowing exactly what to expect. He'd been briefed extensively on Veth protocol for recognition audiences: what to do, what not to do, where to stand, how to position himself in relation to the Queen without accidentally communicating something unintended through body language. He'd prepared the way he always prepared, thoroughly, without drama, doing the work. He stood in the formal position. The Queen entered. She spoke first, as protocol required, but what she said was not the formal recognition statement the protocol staff had expected. Instead, according to Darius's account, she addressed him directly and personally in a way that bypassed the formal structure entirely. She asked him why. Not rhetorically, genuinely, she wanted to understand. And Darius told me that he stood there for a moment, in a room with the sovereign queen of the Veth Dominion and 40 centuries of Veth tradition, trying to find the honest answer rather than the right-sounding answer, because something about the directness of her question made the right-sounding answer feel like an insult. He told her the truth. He told her that it wasn't a decision, that in the moment there was only one thing that made sense to do, and his body was already doing it before his mind caught up. That he didn't know if that said something specific about him, or something general about humans, maybe both, maybe neither. That he'd grown up believing in some not fully examined way that if you were in a position to protect someone and you chose not to, you had to carry that for the rest of your life, and he didn't want to carry it. He told her he hadn't thought about what she was. Queen, alien, ruler of 43 systems. He'd thought about what was happening. Someone was in danger and he was in a position to do something. He said, "Where I'm from, that's enough reason." The Queen, according to the Veth Court summary, was silent for a long time. Then she said, and this is from the translated summary, so I can't guarantee perfect accuracy, but this is what we have, that in 12,000 years of Veth civilization, they had never encountered another species that treated the simple fact of being in a position to help as sufficient moral justification for action. That Veth moral philosophy required extensive consideration of relationship, obligation, hierarchy, and communal decision-making before individual action could be sanctioned. That humans, apparently, sometimes skipped all of that and went straight to the action. She said she was still deciding how she felt about that. But she said she suspected it was important. Chapter 15. What the Teshari commander said. I tracked down the commander of the Teshari, the Queen's personal guard, about a week after the second meeting. His name, in the closest transliteration, was Vershkam, and he had spent 31 years in the Teshari and was considered one of the most respected officers in the Veth military. He agreed to a brief interview with the caveat that his comments would represent his personal views and not official Teshari doctrine. I asked him how he'd experienced the moment of the attack, specifically Darius's intervention. He was quiet for long enough that the translation system registered a pause. Then he said, "I did not understand it in the moment." My immediate response was that the human had broken containment protocol and was adding a complication to an already complicated situation. I asked him when he'd changed his view. "When I reviewed the trajectory analysis," he said, "when I saw in the reconstruction where the round would have gone without the human's intervention." A pause. The human was not adding complication. He was covering a geometry failure in my formation, a failure I had not seen. He saved her. He saved her, yes, and he did it in under 2 seconds, which means he saw a thing that my entire team with 30 collective years in protection service had not seen in the same time frame. He paused again. That is, as a professional, something I have to sit with. I asked him if he'd spoken to Darius. "I did," he said, briefly. "I told him what I just told you, that he had seen a gap in my formation. I expected him to receive it as a compliment." "And did he?" Vershkam made a sound that the translation system flagged as wry amusement. "He said he wasn't trying to find a gap. He said he was just trying to get there in time. He said he genuinely had not, in that moment, analyzed the geometry of the formation. He had seen someone in danger and moved." Another pause. "I am still thinking about what it means," he said, "that the result of pure instinct was more tactically precise than what my training produced." Chapter 16. The Gorathi situation. I want to spend some time on the political fallout, because it shaped the aftermath in ways that matter. The Gorathi separatist who had fired the weapon was, as I mentioned, a member of a splinter faction with no official connection to the Gorathi government. The Gorathi government, which had its own separate and legitimately important diplomatic relationship with the Veth Dominion, was put in an impossible position. They had nothing to do with the attack. They condemned it immediately and completely. They cooperated fully with the station security investigation. They offered reparations. None of that, in the immediate aftermath, entirely mattered to the Veth public, who saw a member of the Gorathi species attempt to assassinate their queen. The Gorathi ambassador to Kurl Station, a veteran diplomat named Grath Sewer, whom I'd spoken with briefly during the summit, gave a press statement that I thought was one of the most difficult things I've ever watched a diplomat do. Standing in the press bay, knowing that every word was being relayed to both the Gorathi home world and the Veth Dominion, trying to find the language that was simultaneously complete condemnation and a demonstration that this act didn't represent his people. He was visibly in pain. That's not a metaphor. The Gorathi have physiological stress responses that manifest visually, and his were present and significant. At the end of the statement, he said something that struck me. He said, "The human soldier's act of sacrifice has reminded us, all of us, every species present at this station, that the choice to protect transcends the question of who deserves protection. The soldier did not protect the queen because humans owe allegiance to the Veth. He protected her because she was a person in danger. This is a lesson that reaches beyond the incident itself." He was, I think, also speaking to his own people, about what it looked like to choose the right thing over the politically expedient thing. The Gorathi-Veth diplomatic situation took about 2 years to fully stabilize. The separatist faction was significantly degraded by the subsequent crackdown, though not eliminated entirely. The relationship between the two species is, as of today, strained but functional. The relationship between humanity and both species is better than it's ever been, for different reasons. Chapter 17. The story goes wider. 6 months after the incident, I was asked to contribute to an anthology of accounts from the summit. 12 journalists from 11 species, each writing about the same event from their perspective. It was a Veth academic initiative. They were trying to document the incident as thoroughly as possible from multiple experiential vantage points, which is actually consistent with how Veth historical scholarship operates. I read the other contributions when the project was complete. What struck me was how differently each species had perceived the event, even those of us who had been in the same room. The drawn correspondent had focused almost entirely on the tactical dimensions, the geometry of the attack, the security failure, the physical specifics of the intervention. The Gorathi correspondent, who had been present as a junior aide to the delegation, had written something that was partly an account and partly a cultural reckoning. The Veth correspondents, there were 3 of them, had each focused on different aspects of the Queen's response, and had interpreted the chromatic shift in her bioluminescent markings differently from each other, which generated significant scholarly debate afterward. What I noticed, reading all of them together, was that every single account agreed on the basic facts and disagreed about what those facts meant. The event itself was stable. The meaning was still being negotiated. I think that's actually the most honest thing I can tell you about historical moments. They don't arrive with their interpretations attached. The moment is the moment. The meaning is what we make of it together over time. But some things seem to be converging, even across the disagreements. Every account, human, Veth, Drawn, Gorathi, and the others, noted the speed of Darius's action. Every single one flagged it as significant, the lack of hesitation. And every single account, in different ways and from different cultural frameworks, circled the same question: what kind of civilization produces people who respond that way? Chapter 18. What Darius did after. He stayed in the Guard Corps for 3 more years. The exchange program with the Veth Armada, the first of its kind, took him to the Dominion home world for 6 months. He was embedded with a Veth Armada reconnaissance unit, working in a capacity that required both security expertise and a significant amount of cultural translation work. He learned some Veth. Not fluently, because Veth language is genuinely difficult for human vocal physiology, but enough for basic communication and enough to demonstrate respect for the attempt, which in Veth culture counts for a great deal. He corresponded, I'm told, with Vershkam throughout this period. The Teshari commander had taken an unusual interest in human training methodologies and was trying to understand whether there were elements that could be incorporated into Teshari protocols. Darius apparently sent him detailed breakdowns of Guard Corps training regimens and psychological preparation methods. Vershkam sent back analysis of Teshari formation doctrine, with specific attention to the geometric gaps that the incident had revealed. It was, as Colonel Enkemdirim told me, probably the most practically significant military exchange that came out of the whole affair. After the Guard Corps, he took a position with the new Human-Veth Cultural Exchange Initiative, a formal program that had grown out of the treaty, bringing members of each species into sustained professional and social contact with the other. He worked in that role for several years, doing work that was unglamorous and essential, helping humans navigate Veth contexts and helping Veth visitors navigate human ones. He settled, eventually, in one of the orbital habitats near Proxima Centauri, one of the mixed species residential stations that had started developing once the treaty opened up some new settlement frameworks. I interviewed him once more, about 4 years after the incident. We met in a small cafe on the habitat, the kind of place that had sprung up to serve the mixed population, with atmospheric management and multi-species menu options, the kind of thing that would have been unimaginable 20 years earlier. I asked him what he thought about when he thought about that day. He was quiet, but this time the quiet was different from the quiet in the medical bay. This was a more settled quiet, the quiet of someone who had had time to understand something. I think about the 40 feet, he said. I think about what it means that those 40 feet turned out to matter, not just to me, not just to her, to everything that came after. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. You spend your life trying to figure out if the things you do matter. Most of the time you can't tell. Most of the time the feedback is muted. You do your job and you do it well, and you never know if it made a difference to anything beyond your immediate circle. He looked up. That day, it turned out that 40 feet mattered to the shape of things. I didn't know that when I was running, but it was true anyway. He paused. I think a lot of what's important is like that. You don't know in the moment how much it matters. You just have to be the kind of person who does it anyway.